To put this whole thing in perspective, many of you probably who are old enough would remember that ICF at one time, and still technically has 11 competencies. And those 11 competencies were sort of condensed into accessible markers, which were just 9, by combining the last 3 competencies, which were action, accountability, and planning, into one, which was about creating action, accountability, and planning. And for the last about 3 years, ICF has really devised a fairly comprehensive, logical, workable system in terms of how to assess the competencies through these markers. Most of us who are assessors with ICF, we have been trained in this, apply this for ACC and PCC. Though at the MCC level, the markers have a limited application. It's about a more holistic overview of how the coach presents himself or herself. After several years, I don't know how many years it is, probably 20 years or something, ICF has decided to relook. In the last couple of years, ICF has been at this job of seeking feedback, input, suggestions from various people, from its members, from credentialed people, from outside, and working to refine the competencies to be more in line with what people have fed them back in terms of how coaching works today and what are the needs of the customer. I would have loved to have had Cindy here because Cindy was part of that group which worked on it. I wasn't. So now the competencies have become 8. And we would just take you through the changes, as it were, and how it makes sense in the current context and how it adds value to learners. It certainly adds value to those of us who are trainers, who actually have been following what ICF has suggested for quite a while. So in many ways, it's not for some trainers, because certainly we have been one of those. It's not very different from what we are doing already, because the focus has been on some of the areas that ICF lays far greater emphasis today. Primarily on understanding self, as well as looking at the broader cultural, systemic aspects of coaching. But for those who have just been focusing on the words of the competencies rather than the spirit of competencies, I think it's going to require some changes. So as far as those who've been within the Coach Area system, who have either passed through or looking for additional credentials or who are currently studying with us, there's absolutely no shift required, mind shift required, or action shift required in terms of understanding what the new competencies are. They are built into the way that we teach the system. For those who are from other spaces and who are likely to look for credentials from ACC to PCC or MCC, they would need to be aware of some of the changes that are happening. ICF is looking at providing more information on this. It was just announced today, earlier today, in Indian time, I think around 11 o'clock when I got the message. So we waited. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it yesterday because it would have been too early. ICF, though they said they would issue it on the 14th, well, the timing was different. The US 14th was a little past what we anticipated it to be. By February or January or February next year, ICF would be providing more information on the assessment aspects of these. As far as we know, the marker system is going to remain more or less the same, maybe them fine-tuning. And this would only be known when ICF actually announces that. But it's not going to be a major shift. But the approach, as I said, would include 2 fundamental shifts. One is about more of understanding oneself, as it were, and the others are about the systemic part. Actually, the understanding self has been in the European Mentoring Coaching Council competencies for a long time now. And it was very important. And I'm really glad, and most trainers like us are extremely glad, that this was, which was accepted by all master level coaches, and they worked a lot on this area, has now become a part of the competency. And though systemic coaching has not been specifically put down as a separate competency, it is very much indicated in the way that ICF has worded many of these competencies. So simply put, today what we have is, under what is called foundation, there are two competencies, which are ethics, and the second one is about something to do with self-discovery. We'll come to that, coaching mindset. So earlier, there was one entity called ethics, and foundation actually referred to agreement, if I remember right. And now the foundation has become two sets of competencies. One is about meeting ethical guidelines and professional standards, and the second one is embodying a coaching mindset. We'll go into the details of it a little later, how it incorporates some of the things that we've talked about. Embodying a coaching mindset is primarily as to what the coach ought to be. A lot of it is like the Rogerian concept of client centricity. It's about being aware, self-aware, and engaging in self-development, and so on and so forth. Then follow two other, or three other, I think, which is about building relationships. And the coaching agreement has been brought into this. And instead of saying it's establishing the coaching agreement, now it's talking about, competency talks about establishing and maintaining agreements. I think it's a significant difference in language. So it's not merely about one session that is happening, but it's about a multiple journey through the session, and how do you, once you establish, how you maintain the agreement, and if there are any changes, how does that work? And what about the coaching relationship? What about the coaching process, the journey process, the plans and goals, etc. And it also has a lot about the involvement of the stakeholders, which is extremely important, and looking at various other issues of the client, such as the cultural aspects, the environments, and so on and so forth. So the competency now looks at it in a much more holistic manner. As we go into the details, I'm just at this point in time from memory, it has 8 competencies, out of which the first 4 are about the journey, the other 4 are about the session. Then the next one is about cultivating trust and safety. It was earlier trust and intimacy. Now it's about trust and psychological safety, which is extremely important. And it covers some specific aspects of what needs to be done to be able to create the safety. And I think there is one more, which is about the presence, which remains the same, coaching presence. So these 3, coaching presence, trust and intimacy, trust and safety, and agreement, I think are part of the combination, which is called, I think, building relationship. If I'm not mistaken, I'll just go through it. But these are the first 5 competencies. 2 under ethics. One is just ethics. Second is about coaching mindset. The third is about establishment and maintenance of agreement. The 4th is about trust and safety, and the 5th is about maintaining presence, which is much simpler than what it used to be. And it's just now the essence of what is needed to maintain presence. And then there is one about communication. The communication is about listening actively as well as creating awareness, which means that earlier competencies on what was called powerful questioning, direct communication, have been taken out. It doesn't mean that those are not relevant, but it means that they have been rolled into these 2 competencies the way that they are described, how through active listening or generative listening or empathetic listening, which aims to create awareness, evoke awareness, as it mentioned. How does the whole process of exploration and communication develop into something far more meaningful? And the next 2 are, so the powerful questioning, direct communication, and creating awareness. These 2, 6 and 7, have been removed. Creating awareness has become evokes awareness. And as I said, it's combined with listening as part of the larger communication and It's about how do you listen and create awareness. The last three, the 9, 10, 11, have been combined into one. It's no longer called action. And I think it's very interesting that it's called facilitating client growth, which is about what is needed exactly to move the client forward, not only just within the session and beyond the session. So there are certain competencies which are clearly mentioned there, which would also be probably be translated into the PCC markers at a later point in time, which would allow for some work by the coach with the client in terms of what happens, the learning that happens between sessions. What about the feedback? What about how stakeholders get involved in the process and so on? So essentially, these are now the new 8 competencies. These 8 competencies, once again to repeat, in the sequence is ethics, coaching mindset, it is agreement, it is trust and safety, it is presence, listening, awareness, and finally, it's about growth. So Magda, do we have the competencies themselves, specific competencies? So I'd like to
Yep, let me pull that up. And also for everyone, I put in a link in the chat for a blog post on our website where we have the competencies listed, as well as there's a download with a cheat sheet, essentially, of the new competencies and the text that you see on the screen, or you saw on the screen, comparing the old to the new. So please head over to that blog post later and download that for yourself. And I'll get them all on screen right now. Give me 1 second.
Okay, so if any of these changes are confusing to you in some way, not that we can sort of add much to what ICF has already said, but we can try and clarify that. What does psychological safety mean, and how can it be provided by coaches with no formal? Yeah, it's not about the psychological underpinning of what psychological safety. I mean, for those of you who are not familiar, I think the term came into much greater vogue recently after the Project Aristotle study of Google. And I don't think any of them were psychiatrists or clinical psychologists or anybody. They just studied the way people work together. And they found that in order to be psychologically safe, to create the environment of psychological safety, people need to express themselves freely. They need to trust the other person. And they should not have someone criticizing them. They should be appreciative, and so on and so forth. So, Francois, for whatever it is worth for me, I can just say that it doesn't have anything to do with expertise in any kind of psychology. Though I would suggest that every coach, and I have absolutely no background in psychology, but I found Freud, Jung, and later pretty much everybody, including Martin Seligman, in between, obviously Carl Rogers and Gestalt and everything else, tremendously valuable to me. I think if you really want to be a good coach, you need to understand psychology, because psychology just means that you understand the way the minds of people work, your own and other people's. So for a coach to say that I don't have a formal training, doesn't matter. I don't have any formal training. All that I picked up was by reading, understanding, trying it out. So empathy is a psychological term, but we all understand what empathy means, what sympathy means. Emotions are all deeply psychological, but we all understand what emotions mean. So I'm truly glad that ICF has brought in psychological safety instead of a word like intimacy, which can be severely misunderstood. They could have just left it purely as psychological safety, but they have added trust and psychological safety, which is very, very beneficial to my mind. Okay, so I'm glad that you raised this question. I'm sure many other people may have had this, but not articulated it. But I hope what I have responded is good. We can take it up much more in detail in an advanced webinar. I can take you through specific practices which would help in terms of psychological safety, how to create greater empathy. For instance, in NLP, there are processes like perceptual positions, which allow people to put themselves in other people's shoes, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can talk more about it in other sessions. Okay, so very quickly, I think since we have to cover the whole lot and we may not have the time, we'll answer your questions as well. So the ethical practice, it's not very different from what it was, but what it does also is to add a little bit about the larger environment. It now says it's about personal integrity, honesty, not only in just relation to their client, but sponsors and relevant stakeholders. I think it's a very important difference. It may not seem a big difference, but it's a big difference. Because for the first time, ICF has really brought in the stakeholders into the picture and how they are relevant and how they are impacted and therefore how they are of value, which is absolutely important in any coaching conversation. Many of us who've been practicing for a while now, we have discovered that when we just work individually upon certain clients and make huge changes, transformational changes, when they go back into an environment which is not really experienced coaching or not changed, so they often have problems relating back into that. So they either regress or they resign from that institution. They move away from there, which is a tremendous loss of cost, value, inputs, and everything. And so by trying to bring in the stakeholders into picture, taking their interests, taking their views, making it a co-creative process, it makes a huge difference. And it's a remarkable move forward by ICF. Sensitive to clients' identity, environment, experiences, value systems, and beliefs, that wasn't there before. And though it's not been spelled out that clearly, I wish it had been, but it's certainly about the diversity and inclusion. It's about the larger cultural overview. It's about how each client may be different from another client. So the coach may be different from the client's identity environment. So how does the coach respect and understand and move forward with that? And this is actually coming out much more clearly in some of the other competencies as well. Language appropriate, respectful to clients. I don't think it was very clear in the earlier one on ethics. It was more about confidentiality. And again, it's about stakeholders. And other 4, 5, 6, and 7 are probably pretty much the same as they were in terms of confidentiality, distinctions between coaching, consulting, etc., and referring clients to other support professionals. Let me just see if there are any questions. I also felt direct communication is not included, expressive, powerful questioning, active listening, the new competency. Yeah. Embodies a coaching mindset is completely new. For the first time, there is a very clear competency, which is about what the coach should be. And it follows from the Carl Rogers principle that the coach needs to be aware, the coach needs to be congruent, the coach needs to be client-centric, etc., in order to be a good coach. And that is the mindset of a coach. And it's really an extremely important one. And it really needs to be looked at much more carefully. And in fact, in Coacharia, one of the things that we have been putting a lot of emphasis in the last few years is about how to use the coaching competencies and self-coaching. This, right from the beginning, it develops within the learner the ability to be able to reflect, to be able to understand why we are doing what we are doing, and from there develop the capability to be able to address the client and benefit the client in that way. Quickly, I'm just reading out and I'll expand on some of them as relevant. Acknowledges clients are responsible for their own choices. Absolutely. That's a building block of client centricity. For the first time, it's been spelled out extremely clearly. Engages in ongoing learning and development as a coach, continuous professional development, why CCU is required and why we are doing all these webinars is based on this particular premise, which wasn't there in ICF before. It was very clearly part of the EMCC's, one of its competencies, development. Develops an ongoing reflective practice to enhance one coaching. It was part of the understanding self in EMC, and that has been very clearly brought out here. The coach has to be self-reflective. We always recommend that the coaches should keep a journal, not just when they do the coaching sessions, but even for themselves on a daily practice. Is their coaching mindset extending into what they do in life? Coach remains aware and open to the influence of context and culture of self and others. Again, this is about the larger ecosystem of the client's environment, their own environment, how do they interact. It has got an element of the organizational developmental principles in this. Uses awareness of self and one's intuition to benefit clients, very clearly spelled out here. Develops and maintains the ability to regulate one's emotions. You can go into the Daniel Goleman principle of emotional intelligence to understand, are we aware of what our emotions are? Do we know how to manage our emotions? And as a result of which, are we in a position to gauge other people's emotions and how we can work with other people's emotions? So what he calls as a self and the social management of emotions, extremely important. So this is about EQ and what Peter Hawkins calls the WeQ. It's not just one's own emotions, but moving beyond that into the larger systemic management of emotions. Mentally and emotionally prepares for sessions. This is truly amazing. This is really what every coach should do, center themselves, if necessary, help the client to center and be congruent, be with unconditional positive regard for the client, all those kind of things. Seek help from outside sources when necessary. Again, extremely important, which in a sense refers to supervision, which has not been spelled out, but certainly supervision is a tremendously powerful outside source from a more senior coach or even another peer coach, just to understand from another's lens how they react to what we are doing and why we are doing what we are doing. Okay. Amit Burman asked a question, how do you prepare for the sessions when we do not know what will emerge? It doesn't mean you are preparing for the sessions, Amit. It is just mentally, in fact, I would put it this way, be prepared for what you do not know will happen. That is all that you're doing. Coaching is about not knowing. So you are centering yourself, you are just congruent. All that you are doing is focus yourself on the client. If you're a photographer, you would know that when you go into a lower aperture, everything else in the background blurs out. Unlike if you take a picture with a box camera. So essentially, when you're in a coaching mode, you are working on a lower aperture and everything except the client is blurred out. So all that you're doing is to address the client curiously, honestly, congruently, empathetically, and with generative listening. So that really is what is important. Seeking help from external sources, two meanings. One was already covered under ethics, which is about that if you're out of your depth, you do not know what to do in a particular case, especially if it's about a traumatic experience, some emotional trauma, and so on and so forth. Just say, I don't know, and I would like you to go to a therapist or a clinical psychologist, someone. And if you know someone, you can recommend them. But here, I think in this particular context, coaching mindset, I'm interpreting this, it's about supervision. That when you are confused, when you are not sure what you're doing is right, you seek a supervisor's help. If the supervisor himself, herself is not able to help you, okay, you may go somewhere else. But basically, it's about supervision, right? Co-creating a relationship, which is the next three, agreement, trust and psychological safety and presence. Establishing and maintaining agreement, the basic difference here is not just about the session, but also outside of the session, before the session. And it could be even after the session. It says establishing agreements for the overall coaching engagement as well as those for each coaching session. This is extremely important because for a long time, the coach trainers were just focusing on what is to be done in the session. So I still remember in the early days when I was training, coaches would come back and say, hey, Ram, you've taken us through this and we are now very good. We can take one session. But then when I am working with multiple sessions, 6 sessions or 9 or 12, what do I do? How do I structure it? What is it that is involved in this process? So that is being, of course, it's not every single factor is not being put down there, but there's reasonable amount here which would enable us to be able to do that and for the trainers to develop this further. So the first one is explain what is coaching and what coaching is not, and describe the process to the client and relevant stakeholders. Assume that the person to whom you are putting this issue, which happens very often when a company asks you or someone asks you, hey, I want you to do some coaching. They have heard about it from somebody else. You need to really explain to them what are the boundaries of coaching. And we use axis of asking to telling, past to future, and say coaching lies on the highest level of asking and the future. Whereas, let's say, therapy would be on the past and telling, or consulting would be future and telling, and so on and so forth. So it needs to be very clearly put out to the sponsors and the client and the stakeholders as to what coaching does and how what coaching may not do. Magda has just produced a very, very simple 3-minute video that will be shortly up on the Coacharia website about what is coaching, what is systemic coaching. These explain in very, very lucid, very simple terms, but fully bring out the essence of what these are. The second one is reaching agreement about what is and what is not appropriate in the relationship, what is and what is not being offered, and responsibilities of the client and the relevant stakeholders. Extremely important. This follows from the first one, not just about the coaching, but specifically in this relationship, what is involved, what the coach does not do. The coach does not provide solutions. The coach is not a mentor. And what is the responsibility of the client? Client has the responsibility to work on what the client has agreed at the end of a session as action learning and come back with something that the client has done. And what do the stakeholders do? They become stakeholders with express sort of view of supporting the client in what way they should. They would provide feedback if necessary. They would provide what Marshall Goldsmith calls as a feed forward, and so on and so forth. These are some of the things which we routinely do as part of a proposal to a client and a sponsor. Third, reaches agreement about the guidelines and specific parameters of the coaching relationship. These are the commercial ones, operational, logistics, fees, scheduling, termination, confidentiality, especially very, very important that if you're coaching with an executive client, that whatever happens in the session stays between you and the client. And if someone else outside, even if they are the supervisors, if they want to know, they would have to learn that from the client and not from you. It's a completely zero tolerance kind of a rule that needs to be followed. Otherwise, it'll be a disastrous one. And very often it's even many supervision sessions. In fact, this was a topic which come up very often. What happens with a client who turns up, doesn't turn up, client who comes up late, and what do I do? I have fixed my time, mostly from Western coaches. Most of us in Asia, we probably shrug it off and say it's part of our life. But a Western coach who sort of slots it into specific hours, oh, my hour starts now, my hour ends now. So this is an issue, it's a genuine issue. And it should be, and it's a professional relationship at the end of the day. This video is unavailable. I'm not quite sure what it is. I come from an association of coaching background, and as ICF allows some mentoring into coaching. It depends on what you call mentoring. Mentoring, if it's about the coaching competencies, yes, but if mentoring is about offering solutions, no. But it is a very highly disputed kind of scenario. Many people who practice with executives and so on, like I do, you would have to introduce some amount of mentoring and coaching in terms of guiding them based on your past experience and so on, perhaps more as analogies and metaphors and stories perhaps, but making it very clear that this is your experience and need not necessarily apply to them. So what I effectively do would be to say, hey, I take off my coaching hat and I put on a mentoring hat. So there are multiple such issues that need to be thought about. ICF, in the earlier competency model as well, not in the markers, did say somewhere, light suggestion is okay. How light is something, again, it is something, yeah, it can be contracted, I agree with you, between the client and the coach. If it is contracted, that there would be a certain amount of mentoring. You are absolutely right. In fact, one of the recent discussions that I had over the last few years, the corporate trend is to look for people who are coaches and mentors, not just coaches. Nobody has the time. A senior executive has no time to sit and be explored. they would like to engage in a conversation with someone who speaks that language. Like a CEO would like to be coached by a CEO. A guy in an IT business would like to be coached by someone who has some background in IT business. It's a normal human tendency. And so coaches should be pretty, they should accept that. Though, by and large, the process of coaching is non-dimensional, but it does make a difference. The fourth one is still about the larger journey. I'm going back into the competencies, partnering with the client and relevant stakeholders to establish an overall coaching plan and goals. It's very, very important to involve the stakeholders in the goal, not just the supervisor, who are the other people. Very often I get the client to discuss with other team members if the issues are about delegation and so on and so forth, maybe even get a 360 feedback from them, all that kind of a stuff. And this, again, borders on systemic coaching, which is what you would do in a systemic coaching exercise. The remaining ones are here about the coach and the client, partnering with the client to determine coach-client compatibility, which is why we call it a chemistry meeting, even before we start the coaching session. The others are pretty much the same as they were before. Identify or reconfirm what they want to achieve in the session outcome, clearly what needs to happen within the session. I often use this word, something that the coach and the client can bite, chew, digest, and spit out as an outcome. If they don't do that, if it's a larger goal, if it's a dream goal, if the client says, I want to lose weight, and the coach starts exploring how to lose weight, it doesn't make any sense. There's no way the client is going to lose weight in the session unless you take a knife to the client. So similarly, for everything, you need to go much deeper and granularly establish what is the outcome within that session. And that's one of the most important parameters in coaching conversation within a session. Partner with a client, need to address or resolve. This used to be what was called CC 2.4 earlier. What could be potentially barriers or blocks, limiting beliefs, etc. And part 8 is reconfirm measures of success. This used to be CC 2.2. Partner with the client to manage time and focus. It's new. I think quite appropriate. Do you start with an understanding with a client? Very often we advise coaches to say, hey, how much time do we have together? And what is it that we really want to discuss? So you started that way to establish a relationship. That's excellent in terms of later you can point out, look, we are nearing the end of our session's time. So could we sort of take some of these issues at a later point in time so it can continue into our next session, and that can itself become a point of action. Continue coaching in the direction. This used to be CC 2.5. Partnering with a client to end the coaching relationship in a way that honors the experience. A very, very good point. It really is about the totality of the ethical experience that the coach and the client should have, the client centricity. Yeah. Vijay says CC2 has been kept quite intact except CC 2.3 missing. Yeah, you're very right, Vijay. I'm not quite sure why. I personally, I remember we had long conversations during your journey on the importance of 2.3. I think you should be glad that it was dropped, but I think it should have been retained. Magda, is your video, what is coaching and how to, yeah, yes, Magda has prepared that video that's going to be published in a few days' time. I don't know when. David Peterson, WX Webinar, as we commented on his position to take on advisor's puzzle problem. To advise puzzles like, see, I'm not quite sure whether David Peterson and David Goldsmith are ICF certified coaches. So they certainly are very good coaches. Marshall Goldsmith, for example, takes a view that this whole aspect of not being advisory is wrong, but I don't quite agree with that. I think coaching is about creating awareness in the client. It's not about the coach providing a solution. So it's a slippery slope, and which is why ICF is extremely careful to say that solution, advisory, suggestions, etc. are not permitted, whereas EMCC takes a broader view. But surprisingly, for those of you who may not have known much about EMCC, I've had very detailed discussions with the founders of EMCC. Their definition of mentoring is very much like coaching. They don't say mentoring is about providing solutions. Mentoring is about guiding the client with your intuitive background and experience but leading the client to their own awareness. So we need to understand that. So I'm not quite sure what David Peterson said, but I'm sure with his knowledge and experience and position as chief coach of Google, he would be in line with the need for creating awareness rather than providing solutions to anybody.
Hey, Ram, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but could we focus on the new competencies and save discussion for later, just because I'm mindful of time?
Okay, so we have about another 20 minutes. Sure, I'll try and do that.
Thanks.
So I'll take the questions at the end. Just go through the questions if there's anything else that I need to address. Cultivates trust and safety. This has remained. My own personal viewpoint was that presence and safety could have been combined together, psychological safety and presence. Perhaps it would have been more compact. But anyhow, this is the fact that psychological safety has been included here, as safety is extremely meaningful. Seeks to understand the client, the context, identity, the larger. This wasn't there before. It was about acknowledging and supporting, blah, 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 in CC3. Now in CC4, as trust and safety, it's much more about the total context. Respect for the client's identity. Again, the respect is not just about what the coach sees as a client, but the larger perspective, the holistic perspective of what the client is. Acknowledging, respecting clients' unique talents. This was partly there before. Showing support, empathy, and concern, it was there before. Acknowledges, supports very specifically here about the feelings, perceptions, concerns, etc. Demonstration of openness and transparency. So the whole aspect of trust and safety has been expanded in a way that the client is able to express much better, and the coach is able to discern what the client is looking at, not just in words, what the client is saying in words or not saying in words, but a much larger perspective of emotions, energies, and so on. So I'll quickly cover that. And I see that Cindy has come in here. I would like to give her some time in terms of going through this carefully. Maintaining presence pretty much remains the same. In fact, earlier there were 8 markers in PCC. So now it's been reduced to, I think, 5. Magda, if you can just take it up a bit. Yeah, there are 6 of them now. Earlier, there was a lot about sharing and inviting and so on and so forth. Now it's pretty much about the curiosity, empathy, looking at emotions, working in a space of not knowing and silence, which are very, very important, which were there before. Some of them were in some of the other competencies, like perhaps exploring or direct communication. I'm not quite sure where they were, but they have been brought in here. So it become much more focused at this point in time, but there's not much difference in the whole concept of what presence is about. It's about partnering, and partnering from curiosity, and how do you work with the client with a complete awareness of the holistic sense of the client. Yeah, the next one, please. Yeah, so the communicating effectively has now sort of, earlier awareness was part of the last section of I think it was action, growth, etc. So that's been brought into the communication, and exploring powerful questions and direct communications have been taken out. So in the listening, again, what you would see here is the whole thing about the number 1, client's context, identity, etc. The totality, the systemic approach, the holistic approach of the client is very clearly spelled out here, and that's one of the threads which is going through right through the new set of competencies. The rest of them are pretty much the same. I think energy shifts and voice and language, all those kind of things. Sessions to discern themes and patterns. I think it was there in one of the competencies. I'm not quite sure, but it's very specifically mentioned, because all of coaching is really about connecting the dots. So listening is about really the ability to connect the dots. Evoking awareness. So from the listening, we jump clearly directly into awareness, skipping the earlier questions and direct communications. And here, as you see, a lot of these points which I mentioned there, they are not quite the markers, but the sub-competencies are about questions, actually. It's about challenging the way to create awareness, asking questions in terms of the value systems and so on, asking questions to explore beyond current thinking, inviting. So the whole other parts of the communication, as it were, in terms of questioning and direct communication are built into it. Cindy can point out because she has been part of this effort, and so whether there were any specific reasons, any specific other discernible issues out here. The last one, I'll quickly cover this up, is so there's some more evoking, invite the client to generate ideas about how they can move forward, what they are willing and able to do. So it's not really about just a session, but it's beyond the sessions, what happens, reframing perspective. So it's a lot more. Earlier there were about, I think, 6 or 7, I'm not quite sure how many. Now there are 11 sub-competencies, which are much more in detail. Awareness is one of the most important outcomes of a coaching session. The action really happens outside. The idea of the action, how to design it, happens inside. So awareness is an extremely key competency. So finally, competency 8, which is the last competency, facilitating client growth, rather than being called action, accountability, etc. It's more about the process of how the client grows into the future, into the outcome that the client wants in a generative sense. So here you will see there are many of those previous ones which are pretty much there. 6, 7, and 8 are very similar to what they were before. Inviting the client to consider how resources, support, and potential barrier was there before. There's some which are new in the sense of integrating new awareness, insight, or learning into their worldview and behaviors. Partners with the client design goals was there before. Acknowledges and support of client's autonomy. This is new, which is, though it refers to accountability, it also recognizes autonomy of the client. So I'll stop here. I think I've covered the gist of it. For many of you, I don't think this is going to be any major difference, but I would like to leave this to Cindy now to talk about some of the whys of why these changes have taken place and what is the rationale and essence behind that. Over to you, Cindy.
Hi, everyone. Apologies that I'm late. It's all the storms in KZN. So this is an updated model. I'm sure Ram has told you that. It's not new, it's more an updated model. And the updated part was to keep in alignment to how coaching is in the current workplace or progressing, how coaching is progressing. And the way it was done was not people getting together, sitting and unpacking core competencies. It was done in a way that asked these questions. How are you interacting with your clients? What are you noticing about your clients? And commonalities began to emerge from coaches around the world on how they were interacting and what was currently showing up. So when you see new words added into the core competency, so I'll talk about the new words first. When you see additions, it's simply because these were current trends in coaching coming out of coaches that were doing coaching, coming out of clients that was invited into this process. Sorry, not clients, non-coaches that was invited into this process, and some HR people also. So it was a mixed bunch, it was a mixed group that did this kind of research that picked up new words. And you see words like all stakeholders and culture and systems now all being included. But what's really the same, or what's the trend of coaching that's the same, is the way we partner with the clients and the way we show up as coaches. I think that's even better enhanced now with that competency called embodies a coaching mindset. Now, it's not like all of us are not doing self-development and, keeping abreast of, how we develop ourselves, how we reflect and how we continue. But now it's just, the difference is it's put into a core competency dedicated to coach growth, coach reflections, and how coach shows up in a coaching process. So those are some of the newer parts. Some of what remains the same, of course, as I was saying, it's the partnering. And some of what is dropped is the repetition of pieces of core competencies. I'm sure you would have all noticed that, pieces like what is the coach noticing, empathy, what is the coach hearing, we're kind of repeated in quite a few markers on the old one. It's now become a little bit cleaner, which is why, there's a reduction from 11 into 8. It's just become a bit more shorter and succinct. But the essence of the old is still there, and it's just the addition of the new in keeping with new and current trends. And I have a feeling that we didn't get into Q&A as yet. So if you have questions, please put it on the chat or join the panel so we can answer some questions.
Yeah, we did address some of the questions,
Okay.
Cindy. Yeah, but I just would like to quickly cover 2 questions. Vijay is talking about between the old CC8 and the current CC7. Yes, she's right that earlier the first 3 questions in CC8, if I remember, an awareness were about addressing the who of the client, the what of the client, and situation, and so on and so forth, outcome. So those have been taken out. But if you really look at the holistic sense of the way the client is interpreted, the client's personality, the assumptions, value systems, and beliefs, the focus is still very much on the who. And the earlier probably 7, if I'm not mistaken, of the awareness, now it has increased to 11. So there's a very powerful focus on the awareness, and it's been brought into the ambit of communication as an endpoint of communication rather than the beginning of action. So in a sense, what we always talk about is the 3A model, the moving from the unconscious incompetency to the conscious incompetency is really the first step. And that's very, very clearly outlined here. Another question that Francois has asked, I think it's very relevant. Francois, your question is very correct, very interesting. It really depends on who you're addressing this question to. If you ask ICF, ICF defines mentoring and supervision very, very differently. Mentoring is about the competencies, the skills, that's all. So you mentor a coach in terms of the competency model, in terms of how they actually do that. Whereas supervision is about going into details of what happens in a session when they conduct psychological aspects of it rather than the functional aspects of it. But if you ask EMCC, their approach to supervision can be both because it's a combination of mentoring and coaching. When I do supervision, if you use a 7I model, for example, Peter Hawkins is from UK, and therefore if you see the first 4 elements of the supervision model, the first 3 are very, very clearly on the mentoring mode. It's about what is it about the client, what is it about the transactions that you had with the client, and what kind of questions did you ask, and what was your relationship, and all that kind of stuff. It's only the last 4 which completely shift into a different mode. So it very much depends. I don't want to get into who's right and who's wrong, but I think both need to be. But very clearly in a supervision, what happens is the relationship between the coach and the client. And the coach is coming with an issue. How do I handle this client? What do I do when the client asks me these kind of questions? It's not about saying, hey, how do I improve my competency of presence or psychological safety? That's very unlikely to be the case. That's going to be more a question with a trainer and a mentor. So that's where I would like to leave that. My sense from the first 2, yeah, sorry, Cindy, you take it over. There's another question from Vijay, if you could answer that, anything else?
And yeah. Arish is asking a good question also. Does that mean we're moving away from the who of the client when talking about systems? No, it's not at all. It doesn't mean that at all. It's now an acknowledgement that the client is not an isolate, but that all systems around the client is acknowledged, meaning the environment the client focuses in is also taken into consideration if that's what the client is speaking about. So it's not saying, let's not talk about your work, let's only talk about this. While we're talking about health, let's leave work aside. If many environments and systems come into play, then we are acknowledging the who of the client. What was Vijay's question?
about the session, the overall session importance has been diluted.
Vijay, I'd like to ask you how has it been diluted?
Because the markers do not cover all the sessions.
Put your question in, type your question there, Vijay, or join the panel. How do you feel it has been diluted?
Maybe as we're waiting, we can answer other questions since we only have a few minutes left.
The other one.
Yeah, I mean, Cindy, I mean, one way that, yes, superficially, yes, because there's a lot more about other issues of what's happening in the total session. And I completely agree with that. That's the way it should be, because coaching is not just about a snapshot of what happens in a particular conversation, and that sets the scene for everything else. And I think it's a very welcome move for ICF to bring in, for example, understanding of self, which may not be measurable in a conversation with a client, but it's about a larger perspective. So it may have probably what needs to be done, like EMCC does, is a much more reflective kind of separate assignment through which coaches are measured as well. So something like that may not necessarily have to happen. But yeah.
There's also a new, sorry, not new, updated code of ethics that's going to be released. I think it's on the 10th of December.
Yeah, we have received it, but it will be publicized, I think, in another,
Yeah, the we meaning training schools have received it. So it's just like how the updated core competencies was phased in. It's the same process with the code of ethics. Training schools have received it, and all ICF members will receive it. I think the date was 10th. It's somewhere around there, if I don't have the exact date. And you'll be quite pleased with some of the changes there. You know, there's a nice sense of accountability and responsibility and honoring clients that shows up now in coaches. So wait for that, and you'll also be quite pleased with that. Now, coaches, I've also got to say this, because I myself am feeling this. The pieces of the changes here, it's not something we're all going to know how to do that right now. I think because they've given this quite a long phasing in period, the updated one into the old one. And I think we've got to give ourselves a time to use the competency, the new ones, new pieces, see how it sits and adjust and, you know, learn about it ourselves. So I think it's going to be an ongoing learning process for all of us.
Cindy, having said that, I think, for instance, we have been, for a long time now, have been working on this understanding self, self-discovery, self-coaching and stuff like that. So it's nothing new, or we have been working on the systemic aspect. But if someone has been just going by, this is what I explained earlier, by the letter of what the competencies were, rather than the spirit of the competencies, yes, it's going to be a shift. But for many of our learners, it's probably all there, but it needs to be sort of specifically made aware of. This is what I think is going to happen. But I completely agree with you. It's a very welcome move. A couple of things I wish that has been added on is, one is the space that you are working on now, researching. How does coaching bring in that element of leadership development in some way? I think that's, to me, it's a very important aspect of what coaching is, especially the application part of that coaching, which, for example, the Center for Credential Education and BCC, they have applications in life and work and address that aspect. Another one, which is not there that clearly, which is extremely important from a customer's point of view, is about the evaluation and assessment and how do we use 360 feedbacks and so on as part of the coaching effort, which would, again, it's not about the session, it's about the totality of the coaching effort. And I think probably that would happen over a period of time. Barring these, I think it's a very, very powerful improvement, updating as you called it. Yeah.
And I love the fact that culture is now included, because we all work with clients across the globe in different cultural and diversity space. And I think many of us sometimes just wonder, how do we bring in the core competency when a cultural element is influencing the way that client is working or the way that client is showing up? And now that, this word culture is there, we can begin to develop it and see how it's working out in coaching. So I'm really glad that there were some inclusions. I haven't found something that I'm not pleased about as yet, but it's early days. We'll see as we go along.
And I'm just going to jump in quickly and say something. We will also be recording short videos with Cindy and Ram on each of the new competencies. So any of you who need a refresher or just, a bit of confidence booster that, yes, these are still very much in line with what you've been taught if you're already a coach, or in line with what you're learning if you're a new coach. You will be seeing those videos in the coming weeks on our YouTube channel. And I do encourage you to also, I've put a link in there a couple of times, I'll put it again. We have a blog post, which we refreshed last night, where you can download the new competencies. You can download the comparison of the before and after mapping, so you can see directly how things changed. But in the blog post, there's also a little table that has a list of the major areas of coaching competencies in general. And it has a tick as to which of the coaching bodies addresses the competency and which one doesn't. So that you, if a couple of people asked about EMCC versus ICF, we can do a detailed comparison. We don't have that yet, but we have at least a general one, so you can see how things compare. So the link is again in your chat. If you go right now, that's the latest thing in your chat.
Yeah, but Magda, I'd like to answer Francois' question. Even EMCC's comparison is not about sub-competencies. They only talk about the larger 8 or 9, whatever it is. So that we already have, like you sent it to me and we had looked at it. But the sub-competencies, yeah, I don't know whether it's really worth comparing. But if you broadly look at it, both of them cover most of the aspects. ICF does not cover evaluation models and techniques now. It has, in the updating, it has covered the first 2 competencies of EMCC, which is understanding self and self-development. So it all depends how much detail that you want to go into, which then addresses Vichi's question. Actually, I think this is a far better real-life coaching approach. It is not a very artificial, coaching is not about a session. In the way that the coach has to be trained by a trainer, those details will have to be filled in, and possibly some of those will appear in the marker in terms of how sessions are to be monitored. But it's equally important what is done outside of the session. It's equally important how the coach develops himself or herself. I think those aspects were completely missing before, and I'm very glad that ICF brought that in. So we need to take a larger perspective of what's happening rather than probably feeling that, surely when you reduce from 11 to 8, there is going to be some depth missing. Otherwise, you will have to add 20 sort of specificities in terms of, oh, this is how you should question. You should not be leading. It should not be close, blah, 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 this, that, whatever. So I guess it's a job of the trainer as to how the trainer should develop. The trainer should have separate guidelines, and the responsibility extends. For whatever it is worth, okay, so we will continue this conversation. I think Cindy, during the learner webinars, will be addressing the coaching competencies. Like Magda said, Cindy and I would be recording some sessions. Magda is already putting together short videos on these various aspects. So best of luck. And any questions that you have on this, we would be more than happy to try and address it to the level of our understanding at this point in time, because ICF itself has to go quite some way in terms of fully defining it. Thank you all very, very much.
So before you all leave, a couple of things. So ICF will have some webinars on this, but only in December. Yeah. So that's why we wanted to do this now. We felt like we didn't want to wait a few weeks. So there may be things that we haven't thought of yet. If we haven't, most of you have been on the forum. It's forum.coacharia.com. There is a topic I created last night called the new ICF Coaching Competencies. Please come on that forum. Please tell us just any impressions that you have from the changes and from this conversation this morning, but also use that to put up your questions. You know, obviously we're we're kind of experts in this, but we're not total experts. We didn't put this together. So we will do our best to answer the questions, but I think the forum is actually it's basically created for stuff like this, where we can discuss bigger developments in the coaching community and where we can voice our honest concerns and give each other, feedback and take it forward. So please join us on the forum. I'm sure that Cindy and Ram will both be there as well to comment. This video is already on YouTube in case you want to watch it again, because we were live streaming it. And yeah, later today, I'll send out an email to everyone just with a link to this video, another opportunity to download the new competencies. I will also include the links that we mentioned in the chat, because I think there's a couple good new videos and pages on our website that might be helpful to give some context to this conversation and just coaching in general. So yeah, I think that's it, but please share your questions. It's what we're here for.
And come learn with us. We'll unpack this all together.
Yeah. Coaching program starting soon.
Right. The learner webinar this fourth Wednesday.
Webinars.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot. So can we leave, Magda?
You can leave. Sorry. Bye. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye.